Welcome to an intro of CSS Grid. We'll discuss what, why, and how you can use this powerful new layout system. CSS Grid is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system in CSS optimized for user interface design. This means building better layouts quicker and with more flexibility. It's superior to past grid technology like Flexbox, which was only limited to one axis. CSS Grid allows for two-dimensional layouts, declaring vertical and horizontal areas of space, rather than flexing and floating from left to right. It's standard across all major browsers, Chrome, Firefox, and Edge, so no need to worry about vendor prefixes or installing external packages. It's all available in regular CSS. The killer features of CSS Grid: the ability to find grid areas that can reposition child elements without rewriting HTML. This saves time and space of having to generate different HTML if you want your site to appear differently on mobile devices, for example. Items can be positioned independently and overlap in the Z-axis. Grids can be declared inside of grids, and most of the properties can be declared with other properties, creating fun shorthand syntax that you could create grids even quicker with. So how does it work? Well, all you have to do is declare CSS property display grid on the grid container to create a grid container, and the top level children will automatically become grid items. And that's it. You can define other properties on the parent and child elements to reposition them or change the track sizes. We'll fully go into all the child and parent properties in this course. So as a simple example, I encourage you to go to codepen.io, where you could create your own CSS grid right now. It's really simple. So as you can see on the left, we have some HTML with a container element and then two child elements. And to declare this a grid, all you have to do is say display grid. You can also display inline grid, which does the same thing as grid except displays that element inline. Grid template columns allows you to specify two columns here. Each column represents a track size, and we're using the fractional unit here. Below, you could see the grid that's been generated. As you can see, there's two columns, and this item here is just some extra styling for the items in here. So we're just going to focus on this for now. So now we're going to define some terms. We have a grid container, which, as we discussed earlier, is the parent element. This is our container element for our grid. Next, we have grid item. So these are the items, the children, the top level children, all become grid items. And then CSS Grid will figure out where they are positioned based on the properties of the parent or the properties of the child. Tracks are rows or columns in the grid. So when we say a grid track, we're referring to the separation here, the space between two grid lines. A track size can be a variation of properties here. So as you can see, we can specify a track size as a length, pixel length, a percentage, a fractional unit, the auto property, a repeat property, or a min-max property, and some other properties as well. As an example of specifying the track size here, we can say we have 200 pixels here in this grid column. In this track here, we're specifying 200 pixels here as well. And then using the grid template columns property, we're specifying three columns here. The first column gets the 200 pixels, then the second is the fractional unit, and then the third is the 200 pixels. The fractional unit will stretch to fill the available space there. Grid lines are, as we discussed earlier, these are the lines that are surrounding the tracks. So starting from 1, they're indexed all the way until the end. So if you have 3 tracks, you'll have 4 grid lines. And you can reference these in the child property, grid column or grid row, and other child properties as well. But the grid column property also allows you to specify the names of these lines. So you can name these lines in the grid template columns property. So you can see here I'm naming the lines my line 1, my line 2, my line 3. And the syntax for this, if you remember grid template columns, the lines go where they would be in the grid. So if you name the line before the first track size, that will name the first line, which is 1. And if you can also not name the lines. You don't have to name the lines at all, actually. And you don't actually have to name them in the child either. This is just for if you'd like certain children to specify their position in the grid through the lines, you can do it by referencing the line numbers or the line names. Grid areas are boxes or rectangles that correspond to 4 lines. So using the grid lines, you can specify a grid area. But even better, you can also specify a grid area as a name. So in the parent container, you could specify grid template areas, for example, and specify the names of these rows, which correspond to which actually create these grid areas for you, which can then be positioned through the children. So a more comprehensive example of that is, and more or less illustrating grid template areas, container props, and item props. You can see here we have this other CodePen example that you should try. CodePen allows you to create these, you could create a grid template areas in here, very simple. So the grid template areas right here, you could specify them as rows. So each row is in quotes, and each string there is corresponding to a different column name. And as you specify the column names, it creates a grid area under the hood. So you can see here the grid areas that are created, the header and the header here in the first string, this creates a grid area that's this. So then later the child can reference that by referencing header. So sidebar is this area here, content is this one, and footer down below. And when we reference those with the child grid area props, it will automatically position those grid items into that area. So with just this HTML, we can create a dynamic layout that looks just like this. So that's one of the really special properties of CSS Grid. And the item props, as we mentioned, container props, the item props are just props that you're specifying on the children. And so grid area is a property that we're specifying on item 1, item 2, and item 3, and item 4, and we're specifying different values for those grid areas, just like that. And that's a gist of CSS Grid. With the Gridfolio app, you'll be able to experience over 100 different types of grids. And here are all the different parent properties that we're going to explore, and then the child properties down here as well. So I hope you'll join me in the Gridfolio app lectures, and we've just scratched the surface, so I'll see you there.